Wild card weekend was wild. We'll talk about some of the games that happened there, but here in the Locked On Steelers podcast, we focus on the Pittsburgh Steelers. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're to talk about some roster construction points here, just looking back at the year, looking at some of the finances that have gone into it and what the Steelers can do differently next year and the years forward that I think will make a big difference in their efforts to be a more competitive team. All that here and more on the Locked On Steelers podcast. It's a Monday episode. We're back. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find this show on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Odyssey, and YouTube. If you're watching this video on YouTube, hit the like button on the video if you enjoy it. Hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel to get all of our daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making the Locked On Steelers podcast your first listen every day because we're your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. Just pick 2 to 5 players. And if they score more or less than their prize pick projection, you go up to 10 times your money on any entry. First-time users receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. That's LOCKDON, Locked On at prizepicks.com. Happy Martin Luther King Day to everyone out there. We're back here in the Locked On Steelers podcast. And again, I'm your host, Chris Carter. It was a crazy wild card weekend that I will get to in the next few segments. But here in the Locked On Steelers podcast, we stay focused on the Steelers. And I'm going to lead with some talk here about the construction of the roster, because one of the biggest talking points, I think, above the year about the Steelers and the way they built their roster this year was how they were the most expensive defense in the league, and they spent $100 million on the defense, and 109.8 was the final number at the end of the year or whatever. That was by design. The Steelers, knew they needed to be a defensive football team. They added some veterans who were rather expensive. They paid TJ Watt the big money. They paid Minka Fitzpatrick the big money. They went and got Larry Ogunjobi to pair up with Cam Hayward, who already was making big money. They made a lot of efforts to do that. And that was for this year. We acknowledged at the beginning part of the season, and I think we talked about it all year long, about if this team was going to win, the defense is going to need to be the part that did it. And I believe, if you look at the Steelers games this year, all of their wins came with opponents scoring under 20 points, or 20 points or lower, And so credit the defense for that, but still wasn't what you wanted. You wanted to make the playoffs. You wanted to be more dominant at times. Was tough at times without TJ Watt, but looking at, again, the finances and the salary cap structure of how this team was built versus how next year and the future years teams can build, I think is interesting, because when you look at overthecap.com and SpotTrack and compare the numbers and so on and so forth, you can see the Steelers did spend the most on defense in the NFL, but they also spent the least on offense. And you might think, oh, well, that's just natural. It's a little different because, again, this is why there's a lot of context in how teams are constructed and rosters are constructed, because the Steelers did spend the most on defense and did spend the least on offense, but there were other teams that spent close to what the Steelers did on defense and still put plenty into their offense, like the Bengals, who spent $105 million on their defense, according to overthecap.com, but they spent about $35 million more on their offense. And part of the reason why, well, the Steelers had $36 million in dead cap space because of the holdover from Ben Roethlisberger's contract, the holdover from Stephon Tuitt's contract, and then other ones like Eric Ebron and Melvin Ingram and guys who just the guaranteed money of them was still hanging around. That number drops to $6 million right now. As it is, they'll probably be added to it because of players that they'll let go in this offseason and other things that happen there. But it won't be nearly as high as it was before. And I think with that, you'll see a more significant investment into different parts of the Steelers. And I think one of the things, and it's one I've been harping on all since the second half of the season, and where I think the Steelers are headed. They're headed to be a physical football team. And actually, it's been before, since the beginning of the season. I've been talking about this since maybe even last year when we saw Najee Harris starting to figure some things out as a rookie. But I think the Steelers are ready for the pendulum of the NFL's strengths to swing the other way. And we've talked about this a lot, and how over the past decade you've seen, just the rise of so many different passing teams and so many defenses getting smaller defenders, quicker linebackers versus bigger linebackers, and emphasizing safeties and quicker guys in space to take out teams that like to pass a lot, because that was becoming the surge of the NFL. Well, now in response to that, offenses are starting to try to focus on being bigger and running the football, unless you have Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, the Bengals with Joe Burrow, guys like that who can throw all over the place and just command a ship like that. Not everyone can get that. Not everyone can, wait for the first overall pick of the NFL draft, or stumble into a player like Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen. And this is not me saying that Kenny Pickett can never get on their level, but expecting that from him in the next 4 or 5 years, I think that's putting a lot on a young man's shoulders. But I do think that you have a chance with some of the other skill players that you've added, and with the opportunities of the draft picks that you got coming up, and the money that you can have laying around. Omar Khan with Andy Weidel in fold, who built the Eagles roster and invested in a lot of guys in their trenches to build up their offensive and defensive lines. I think you're going to have this opportunity to build that kind of roster that can compete that way. And we'll get into how this relates to the wild card weekend in just a bit here. But the Steelers don't need to invest. They don't need to be the highest investing team in the offensive line for this to change. We already saw they made progress with, again, the least expensive offensive line, or the second least expensive offensive line. They spent $18 million on their offensive line. The Raiders spent $17.8 million. But we've seen what Pat Meyer, their offensive line coach, who I've talked about for a while now, and saying that y'all need to start singing that man's praises for what he did for this offensive line. Jerry Dulac wrote about that in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette this weekend. I suggest you go read it. But again, when you look at this offensive line, it doesn't need to go from being next to last to the most in spending. It can get back up to the middle part. You can invest in another veteran in free agency. You can invest in some high draft picks. You got a first rounder and basically kind of another first rounder that you can invest into it. That's going to not jump it up that high, but get you out of being in the bottom tier and get you the talent that you need. For example, the Bengals offensive line improved a lot this year, even though right now they're really banged up, but the Bengals offensive line, but they're not the most expensive offensive line right now. They're spending around $30.6 million. That's like just below like the middle of the pack in the NFL as far as spending. But they did that because they by drafting some guys high, by signing some other guys and putting that group together and say, all right, this is what we're rolling with as a position group. But when you look at how their roster was constructed a bit ago, they were among the least paying of their offensive linemen in 2020 and 2021. And they boosted it just up enough, and that changed things for Joe Burrow. But the Steelers, I think, they need to do something different here, because not only were you doing that for Joe Burrow, because again, by the way, the Bengals, while paying for that offensive line, they also had the next most expensive defense in the NFL this year. But part of what the Bengals did was they knew that Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd, they had the receiving group together that they wanted, and the passing game was going to be their focus. And that was how they were going to play. But the Steelers, they can have a really good passing game. And I'm giving you guys a break on Matt Canada talk, which is why I ain't bringing it up every doggone day until we get official news or we get someone else on here to talk about it. I'm taking a break from that to talk about the construction of the roster right now. But whoever the offensive coordinator is, I think you're going to look at the strengths on this team with the defensive players still in place, with the young quarterback, with the young running back, the 1-2 punch at running back, by the way, Najee Harris and Jalen Warren. I think both are a big part of that answer. And you see the potential with, okay, James Daniels was working, Mason Cole was working, Chukuma Okorafor solid, but maybe Kevin Dotson and Dan Moore Jr., either, you invest in guys that challenge them and say, hey, you know what? Either you guys play better or there's going to be someone to replace you, because we need this offensive line to be tip-top shape. I think that's very much part of the answer the Steelers need to find in this offseason. And again, they went and got Andy Weidel to help address that. The way that they played football down the stretch, the grinding plays that they had, some of the grinding drives that were taking up, halves, more than a half of quarter of play to get, field goals or touchdowns. That's the way that the Steelers want to win. I think that when you have a young quarterback, you can afford to do that with what the Steelers are doing. And when you look at the way the roster is constructed right now, if you looked at the Steelers, chances at 2023, they're going to be able to, again, free up a lot of money with the William Jackson III's deal because, he was traded to the team and none of that money's guaranteed. And he was owed about $12.1 million this year that you can just easily chop off. And immediately your cap's going up like that. You can look at contracts for guys like Miles Jack and Chukuma Okorafor and say, hey, you know what, guys, we like you, but let's make this more team friendly so that we can add more to the roster. Then, of course, there's the big money makers like TJ Watt, Cam Hayward, Minka Fitzpatrick, Deontay Johnson, who you can all say, hey, you know what? Let's restructure. Let's get this in. Let's push this down the line, and let's invest in some pieces right now. I think there's a bunch of things that you'll see the Steelers be able to do, and there's other guys down the roster. I'm not going to name every single one, but I think there's plenty of wiggle room that you're going to see Omar Khan create in the coming months, and then you're going to see them reinvest, especially into the trenches on the offensive line, to make this team closer to what I think it will take to beat some of those top teams in the NFL. And we saw some interesting matchups that I think lead to or give more credit to that hypothesis that I'm putting forward. We'll talk more about that in a minute here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, so don't go anywhere. But first, we got to talk to you guys about Prize Picks. Of course, Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy, as I talked about it before. It's a great way to play daily fantasy sports. It's not just your average day gambling. It's picking out players. If you have 2 to 5 players that you think you have a beat on their fantasy on any day, all you have to do is look at the Prize Picks projection that they have for their stats for that day and say, you know what, they're going to get more or less. You get right on your players, you win money. And with some of the entries that you can have, you can win up to 10 times your money on those entries. It's not competing against others. You're not constructing these huge rosters that go up against thousands of people like other apps. This is a chance for you to do with Prize Picks and just simply beat the house, beat the projections on more or less options and make money. Prize Picks doesn't just do this with the NFL. By the way, they do this with the NBA, the MLB, NHL, college sports, and much, much more. So download Prize Picks today or go to the prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. And first-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That's LOCKEDON, Locked On prizepicks.com or by downloading the Prize Picks app. Today's episode is also sponsored by BetterHelp Therapy Online. Life is full of twists and turns, and it's important to show up for yourself through all of them. I've placed plenty of times in my life when I've tried to shoulder burdens, I've tried to figure things out on my own, and I just needed help, and I couldn't find it on my own. This is where it comes in handy to have good therapists in your life, and that's what BetterHelp Therapy Online is here to help with. BetterHelp Therapy Online will assess your needs and can match you with your own licensed professional therapist in less than 48 hours. It's not a crisis line. It's not self-help. It's real professional therapy by licensed professionals done securely online, and it's available to people worldwide. You can log into your account anytime and send a message to your therapist. And with therapy, BetterHelp Therapy Online recognizes, hey, it might not work out the first time. You might not find the right fit every time they pair you with someone, but BetterHelp Therapy makes it easy for you to find that therapist and change anytime you need. And they have a special offer right now for our listeners. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's betterhelp.com/lockedon. 10% off for your first month of online therapy at BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. As we always say here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, when we do back-to-back ad reads, we keep it moving. Now, let's talk more again about where I see the Steelers focusing their spending as far as where they're going forward. Because again, comparing it to some of these NFL games that I'm going to get into that happen this weekend, I do think the Steelers have a chance to build the roster that's going to be the team that can actually compete in some of these games. I'll also argue that if the Steelers had made the playoffs this year, they'd have been right up there with these other AFC teams. The Dolphins almost took the Bills. The Jaguars and the Chargers, well, that was a big mess of a game that was amazing to watch. And we saw the Ravens and the Bengals go down to a Hail Mary pass from a backup quarterback. I do think the makings are there for the Steelers to be competitive and be up against some of those teams. And I also don't think it's that far that they could do better against a team like the Bills or the Chiefs, who both have kind of shellacked the Steelers recently. The Bills did it this year. The Chiefs did it twice last year, even though the Steelers did beat the Bills last year. But the last few seasons, it's felt like last 2 seasons, I'll say that. The last 2 seasons, we all kind of knew what the deal was. The Steelers had one way to win, and that was the defense plays amazing, and the offense doesn't turn the ball over. And if those few things happen and a couple things click on offense, the Steelers could win a game. But this is why we're talking about the Steelers investing in different things this year and investing in more things this year, because they'll have more opportunities to do so with with a lot of dead cap money opening up for them, and why Omar Khan needs to go and get those offensive linemen, because now you're not just winning with defense and not turning the ball over. You're winning with defense and a run game that isn't just hitting because you're getting good matchups and they gelled late in the season, but because they're just better than the opponents on the other side of the ball. And then with the offense that's getting sharper and the passing game that's getting more used to it, then they're actually an asset. And it's not that you're not hoping that the passing offense doesn't lose you a game. You're hoping that there's times where the passing offense can win you games. And that hasn't been really a factor, I think, since the early part of 2020, when Ben Roethlisberger's arm and legs seemed like they were recuperated and they were doing just fine until they wore out later in that season. But the Steelers have kind of been the last 2 years. This has been an acknowledged rebuild where they were going to have a slim path to victory. And when I think of slim paths to victory, I'm not saying that, this team stinks and can't find a way to win. It means that there is one way this team can beat you, and it is this method. And if you stop that method, this team's in a lot of trouble. But really good teams, like the Bengals right now, I think they're a perfect example. They're a team that they can light you up in the passing game, and they can just put up 30, 40 points on you. Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, they will light you up. But they also have a defense that can create turnovers. In one of the most spectacular plays of the weekend, we saw them turn a quarterback sneak into a fumble recovery that went 99 yards the other way for a touchdown. That was the game-winning touchdown. Crazy. But they're a team that can beat you in different ways. The Steelers, I mean, the biggest thing I think that you could say for the offense was that late this season, they figured out how to run the ball better, not great, but better. And that the year before, Ben Roethlisberger was still had that clutch gene in him where he could pull out some crazy stuff at the end, even if he was not good for most of the game. But we also saw Kenny Pickett started to figure that out as well this year. And Kenny Pickett is a guy who's growing and not regressing. And I think that's where the Steelers hope things can go. But again, let's look closer at some of these playoff games where these teams found themselves competing. The only game, crazy enough, the only game that really wasn't competitive this weekend was the Niners-Seahawks game, which when that game was finished and we saw the first half where the Chargers were up, 27 to nothing at one point over the Jaguars, I was just thinking this is going to be the worst wild card weekend ever, and I couldn't have been more wrong. The Jaguars come back, and look at how the Jaguars did this with Trevor Lawrence. He throws, 4 interceptions in the first half, 4 touchdowns in the second half. And part of what balances is Travis Etienne, his running back from Clemson. The two of them really were able to cut him up. Etienne goes for over 100 yards. Trevor Lawrence finds his guys, Evan Ingram, Christian Kirk, Zay Jones, Marvin Jones. They found ways to get it done. And the Jaguars defense stepped up. And I think it's really interesting to see how some of the ways that the Jaguars were able to come back in that game, and some of the things that they did to confuse the Chargers. Granted, the Chargers, Brandon Staley, you can say what you want about them. The Chargers, I think they need someone to right their ship. They've had talent for years. You can go back to the Drew Brees, LaDainian Tomlinson days. For whatever reason, that organization has just been cursed with bad luck and things that don't make any sense. But, again, you invest in the right things like the Jaguars, I think, have started to. You get Doug Peterson in there. You can have some things go your way. I think that you look at that game. You look at the Dolphins game. The way that they were able, the defense keeping up with the Bills, and granted, division rivals, that can make things a little more murky with things. I was a little, I didn't think that game would stay close because I just thought Skylar Thompson would be too bad, and he wasn't great. He had pass rating of 44.7, but the defense coming in with huge plays, a fumble recovery for a touchdown, an interception by Xavier Howard that went 50 yards back the other way and would set them up with great field position. Another interception by Jerome Holland. The biggest thing that the Dolphins didn't have going for them was they didn't have a run game. So they had turnovers and they had some big plays here and there. But no, I think they're running, Jeff Wilson, their running back, averaged 2.3 yards per carry on 10 carries. And there was never a chance to just take the air out of the football for the Bills. And Josh Allen, who was making mistakes, eventually was able to figure out what he needed to do in the end of the game, especially in the third quarter when he put up 2 touchdown passes that basically gave the Bills the lead that they needed to hold on to. But I think that the Dolphins, they were in a rough spot. They had a third-string quarterback. No one's saying, I mean, you could talk about Mike McDaniels and some of the coaching mistakes and mismanagement and the delay of games. You could talk about that. But I look at the Dolphins and the way that they're built, and they're built for big play offenses. But they're a group that, like the Steelers, they haven't invested in their offensive line. They have $25.1 million invested in the offensive line. That's with going and getting a guy like Teron Armstead. But still, they're not a group that has, I think it has the offensive line that's reached the maturation process that you hope that the Steelers can get to at some point. And I think that came back to bite them in this game, where without your quarterback, you didn't have that many other answers other than hoping your defense can create those plays for you. And in doing that, they almost had them, but still came up short. As I've said this before, I think the Niners are a prime example of how this needs to work for the Steelers moving forward. The 49ers are a team that they haven't spent officially too much money, but they've went and got guys that can kill on their offensive line. And you saw them just bullying the Seahawks in that game at times. Christian McCaffrey, 119 yards on the ground. And yes, Brock Purdy went off for 3 touchdowns and over 300 passing yards, but he was 18 of 30 as well. It wasn't like he was dissecting everything they did. And some of the passes that I think there was a good response from enough film gurus on Twitter when people were saying, look at this amazing throw by Brock Purdy. And I was like, that wasn't that amazing of a throw. It got there, but this was also not that great. But hey, the Niners are doing what they're supposed to do. They have an offensive line and a super running back and a group that makes it easier for their rookie quarterback to work. And that's why the Niners are doing what the Niners are doing. I think if the Steelers build towards that model that the Niners have done, I think that the Eagles have done for quite a bit, they can be competitive and win that way. And I want to talk more about this Bengals-Ravens game. I've been saving that for last because I did feel there were some opportunities there for the Ravens to win that game. You had a 14-point swing on a QB sneak that went awry. But outside of that, I still think there's a lot of things to learn from and try to dissect and apply to what the Steelers are trying to do, what Mike Tomlin, Omar Khan, Andy Weidel are putting together. We'll talk more about that in a minute here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. But first, we got to talk to you guys about Ultimate Football GM. I've told you guys a lot about this game, but I'm going to tell you again, Ultimate Football GM, you got to play it right now. It's the chance for you to be that football GM that you've always wanted to be. You want to call the shots on coaching? Great. Call the shots on coaching. Hire all the coaches, from the head coach to the offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, special teams coordinator. You can hire sports psychologists. You can hire team doctors, everything you want. You can build facilities for your team, all those things right in and manage it day to day. After every game, if a player gets in trouble, you decide what happens to them. You decide to punish them, fine them, do whatever. But the whole time, you're building to build championship teams. And 25 seasons, the span that you play in the game, I won 19 championships. Can you do better? Go show me on Ultimate Football GM, and it's free to play. You just download it on your phone. It's simple. And here's the thing. When you download the app on your mobile device, or you go to ultimate-gm.com to play it on a computer. But when you go and play the game, it's free, but you can get a 100% boost on all the stats that you need to build your franchise by using the promo code Locked On in the game store. That's LOCKEDON, all one word, and you'll get a 100% boost on all the stats that you need to build your franchise into a championship organization. So download Ultimate Football GM by going to ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores on your mobile devices. Again, that's ultimate-gm.com, Ultimate Football GM. Start your franchise today. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm Chris Carter, hosting here and coming here on a Monday after what was a really, I thought, hard-fought AFC North slugfest. And I think the Ravens came away the losers of this contest, but I feel like the Ravens have nothing to hang their heads about. With a backup quarterback, they came down to a Hail Mary in the final seconds that got to the hands of a receiver or one hand of a receiver and could have been the miracle that gave them a chance in the end. But the Bengals held on. And again, the Bengals have many ways to beat you. They have a pass rush that can create. They have a defense that can cause turnovers. They had Davis Gaither, had an interception on the day. They had the fumbles they forced at the goal line. They, when the run game wasn't working with Joe Mixon, Joe Burrow was finding ways to keep things alive. Jamar Chase caught 9 of 12. Hayden Hurst was getting plays. T. Higgins made some important plays, and it wasn't the game that they wanted to be, where they could spread out the game and have lots of opportunities, because the Ravens ran the ball, sucked a lot of time off the clock in this game. But still, they found ways to win. And in fact, the Ravens won time of possession, 32 minutes, 27 minutes over the Bengals. But I think that was a game that there were a couple of really bad luck bounces for the Ravens. If that quarterback sneak gets stuffed and they hold on to the football, I believe it was second down when that happened. So you're talking about 2 more shots at it, or a shot and then a field goal. And then, do the Bengals score again in this game? Who knows? But look at the Ravens and the way that they're built, that they were built for this game. No Lamar Jackson, a backup quarterback, and they went toe-to-toe with the Cincinnati Bengals. I'm telling you, and the Bengals, they're the hot team. They match up well, but styles make fights in the NFL. I say this all the time. That's a real saying. They applies to boxing a lot, and I think a lot of people don't know what that means. They just see, oh, well, this team's just better than this team. It's not just about pure talent. It's about how that talent matches up against each other. For example, the Bengals, when they've played some games this year, there's been times they look absolutely unstoppable, and they have since October. You go to the way that they've played this year. They've laid some whoopings on some people. They've gone toe to toe with some of the best. The Kansas City Chiefs. They've beaten them, I think, 3 times in a row now. Last time 27-24. But the things that get to the Bengals, that can make things tough on them, is when you run the football, when you play tough defense, and you don't give them every opportunity to come back and put points on the board. I think the Steelers wouldn't have had to go to overtime with them in the first game when they were creating 5 turnovers against the Bengals if their offense was where it was at the end of the season, when Najee Harris was running the football, Kenny Pickett was managing the offense better, and it wasn't just Mitch Trubisky kind of 3-and-outing all the time and giving the Bengals so many chances during that game. But again, I look at the way this game was played. John Harbaugh, for all his clock mismanagement at the end of the game, which, Mike Tomlin's no saint in that department either. But him holding on to those timeouts, I still think his game plan was the right game plan for this game. They slowed the clock down. They ran the football, and they found different ways to run it. They ran a lot of power with Huntley, and trying to make sure it wasn't just J.K. Dobbins running the football in this game. And Dobbins averaging 4.8 yards per carry, some really good runs from him. You also got the ball to him through the air, 4 catches on 5 targets for 43 yards and a touchdown. I think the Steelers, the Ravens, are a group that is also, they've invested into their offensive line. I I believe the seventh highest, since seventh most expensive offensive line in the NFL. And you see it on plays like that. Whereas the Steelers, they can't run a screen to save their lives. Why? Because their guys they're not those guys. They got sharper, a lot of things to do the basics right. But the better offensive lines, the ones that have the money invested in, the ones that have those high draft picks invested into, that are built on more things, that have more of a foundation with stalwart players, those are the groups that can go out and screen block consistently and not be called for illegal man downfield or holding to ruin those plays. Because how many times can you think back to plays where you were like, oh, the Steelers, this was a great play, and then it got called back because they did something wrong? And oftentimes it was the offensive line. Sometimes it was the tight ends. Sometimes it was other things. But the Steelers can't call screenplays to save their lives, or they can't execute screenplays, because those plays have been called. They just haven't been executed. And the Ravens, their offensive line, I think, is a prime example of, if the Steelers can get close to there. Again, they don't need to be the most elite offensive line next year. I think in the next 2 or 3 years, you want them to start being mentioned among the better groups when they start investing, hopefully, in first round picks in that group, and maybe an expensive free agent vet. But it takes time to get there. But even still, again, this is a. I think the Steelers are a team that they are built differently than the Ravens. The Ravens, the Ravens are a team that they were based in having. They got Calais Campbell. They have guys like Kyle Hamilton, on rookie deals. Lamar Jackson wasn't too expensive yet. We'll see how that situation plays out. By the way, make the trip with the team, which I didn't think was too much of a death knell for the hopes of there. They can still franchise tag him and just see how that plays out. But all things aside, the Ravens have a better balance of their roster because of where they are. They didn't have, nearly as much, there's no franchise quarterback that was holding over them that ends up taking away $10 million in cap space. They have the goods to be competitive even without their star player. The Steelers didn't this past year. I think the Steelers in the next couple years, they should have more talent across the board to address if TJ Watt is missing not for 7 games like it was this year. If you're missing the defensive player in the NFL for 7 games, you're going to be missing him. But for 2 games, 3 games, they might be able to squeeze out a win or 2 in that situation if the Steelers construct the roster right. And there's no guarantee that they will. They got to go prove it. Omar Khan and that front office, they got to go and get the guys this offseason. But I'm telling you, if you go look up the numbers, overthecap.com, Spot Track, wherever you want to look, the way the Steelers were constructed this year kind of was restricted by how little they could invest into the offense. They invested more into the defense because they knew, hey, you know what? This is just the group that's going to have to rule the day. But I think the times are coming when they won't have to do that nearly as heavily to be a competitive team, because the offense is going to start to build with some of its younger skill players, and some of the players that aren't that expensive are going to be more valuable to the success of the Steelers. But also, they'll be able to invest more on that side of the ball. And I do think that there's something brewing with what the Steelers could be in the future years. We're going to be joined tomorrow by a person who wrote a very good piece about that over the weekend, Jim Wexell, who's been on the show before, long-time Steelers writer. But he'll be on the show with us tomorrow to talk about that, because he wrote a very interesting piece that we'll tag you in. He's also written multiple books about the Steelers. His latest focuses on the NFL draft and their history of the draft and building through it. And I want to talk to him more about why he thinks the Steelers are on the cusp of doing something really special and putting together a core that's going to bring a lot of Steelers fans a lot of happy days in the coming years. We'll talk about that then. But thanks again for tuning in on this Martin Luther King Day special episode of the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Read my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. You can also check out this show, the Locked On Steelers podcast, on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Odyssey, and YouTube. If you're watching this video on YouTube, like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of our daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. Again, we thank you for making us your first listen every day. And remember, if you want to help support the show even further, please check us out on Apple Podcasts. And when you do, go give us a 5-star review with a positive comment. You do both at the same time, and you get a special shout out at the end of the show. Like this person, we have Kirby10, who gives us a 5-star rating and says, your podcast keep me very entertained while at work. Keep up the great work. Thank you, Kirby10. We also have another 5-star review we'll read on tomorrow's episode. So thank you very much for those who give us those 5-star reviews. It really does help us out, and we'll give you your shout outs like we did for Kirby today. Thanks again for everyone out here who checks us out. I'll be back Tuesday with Jim Wexel for another great episode of the Locked On Steelers podcast. We'll see you then.